Did Genesis truly skip a chapter, leaving out a crucial prelude to the story of humanity? For centuries, we have looked at the Garden of Eden as the absolute beginning, the first heartbeat of our species. But what if that garden was not the start, but a late arrival? Ancient traditions whisper of beings who walked the earth long before. These narratives suggest that Adam was not the first inhabitant, but perhaps a specialized creation, a deliberate restart. We are taught to see history as a straight line, starting from a single point of origin. But what if that line is broken? What if the ground beneath us holds the dust of predecessors whose names were erased from the record? The silence of the texts is not an absence of information, but a deliberate omission. A haunting possibility emerges. If there were others before him, who were they? And why does the record remain so stubbornly, so intentionally empty? Consider the possibility that recorded history is not a fresh start, but a desperate recovery. What if the world we know is built upon the ruins of a previous, failed experiment? The theory of a global reboot suggests that a cataclysmic event once scoured the earth clean, erasing the footprints of those who came before. Imagine the landscape after such a collapse. Silence, broken stone, and a planet waiting for a new steward. In this light, Adam emerges not as the first man in a vacuum, but as a specialized creation designed for a world that had already seen its own apocalypse. He becomes a bridge, a biological upgrade tasked with reclaiming a shattered home. This perspective transforms our origin story from a simple beginning into a survival narrative. It implies that the dust from which he was formed was not just earth, but the remnants of a civilization that had already risen and fallen into shadow. If the garden was a sanctuary, it was a sanctuary built to protect a new lineage from the echoes of the past. If the story of the reboot is true, then the timeline we accept is fundamentally flawed. This is not a modern invention of science fiction, but a debate that ignited centuries ago. In 1655, a scholar named Isaac de la Pereire published a work titled Pre Adamite that sent shockwaves through the theological establishment. He did not simply guess. He scrutinized the ancient texts with a cold, analytical eye. De la Pereire argued that if one reads the Epistle to the Romans with enough precision, the existence of people before Adam becomes an unavoidable conclusion. He proposed that the world had been populated for millennia before the first breath was drawn in Eden. This was a radical departure from the standard narrative. It suggested that the history of our species was far deeper and more fragmented. The intellectual foundation for a pre-Adamic world was laid, and it has never been fully dismantled. The implications of this hypothesis go far deeper than mere chronology. If humans walked the earth long before the garden, then who exactly was Adam? The argument takes a sharp, divisive turn here. Scholars began to posit that Adam was not the progenitor of all mankind, but rather the specialized ancestor of a single distinct group, the Jewish people. This claim creates a massive, jagged rift in the traditional genealogy of our species. It forces us to view the biblical narrative not as the beginning of all humanity, but as a local event, a specific thread woven into a much larger, older tapestry. Imagine the shock to a worldview that had held Adam as the singular root of every soul on earth. By narrowing his role, the theory effectively strips away the universal status of the first man, leaving the rest of the world to be populated by those who existed in the shadows of the pre-Adamic era. This is not just a theological disagreement. It is a fundamental restructuring of our shared history. It suggests that the story of Eden is not the story of us all, but the story of a chosen lineage emerging from a world already teeming with life. The unity of the human race, once taken for granted, is suddenly fractured by the possibility that we are not all children of the same garden, but survivors of different, parallel origins. If the debate over physical lineage feels too small, too grounded in the dirt of history, then we must turn our gaze toward the heights of Jewish mysticism. Here, the story of Adam undergoes a transformation that defies the limits of the human form. We enter the realm of the Kabbalah, where the name Adam is stripped of its earthly associations and elevated to a cosmic scale. This is the domain of Adam Kadmon, the primordial man. Do not look for a man of flesh and bone here. Adam Kadmon is an entity of pure, blinding light and divine will, existing before the first atom of the material world was ever forged. He is the first emanation of the infinite, the initial spark that ignited the process of creation itself. While the Adam of the garden is a figure of history, Adam Kadmon is the architecture of existence. He represents the blueprint, the underlying structure from which all worlds and all beings eventually flowed. This is a shift from the biological to the metaphysical. If Adam Kadmon is the blueprint, then the Adam of the garden is merely a localized, diminished copy. Think of it as the difference between the architect's original vision and the weathered stone of a building long after its completion. This primordial man is not a character in a story, but the very mechanism of creation itself. Every physical law, every spark of life, and every nuance of human consciousness originates from this singular divine source. By establishing this hierarchy, the mystical tradition renders the biblical account secondary. It suggests that the creation of the world was not a singular, isolated act in a garden, but a cascading descent from a higher, more perfect state of being. The Adam we recognize from the scriptures becomes a reflection, a shadow, cast by the blinding brilliance of the original archetype. This perspective fundamentally alters our understanding of human identity. We are not just descendants of a man who walked in the dust. We are the fragmented echoes of a cosmic entity. The biblical Adam, in this light, is a necessary bridge, a vessel designed to anchor the divine blueprint into the heavy, material world. It leaves us with a provocative question. If the original man was a being of pure light and divine will, what does it mean to be human in a world that has drifted so far from its own blueprint? If we step down from the heights of mysticism and return to the dusty tablets of the ancient Near East, a new figure emerges from the shadows of time. Meet Adapa, a hero of Mesopotamian lore whose existence challenges the uniqueness of the biblical narrative. Adapa was a man of great wisdom, a servant of the god Enki, who stood at the threshold of eternal life. The parallels are striking, almost unsettling. Like the Adam of the garden, Adapa found himself caught in a divine drama that would determine the fate of all humanity. He was offered the gift of immortality, a chance to transcend the limitations of his mortal form, yet he lost it in a single catastrophic moment. This was not a story of a simple bite of fruit, but a tragedy born of misunderstanding and divine trickery. As we examine these two figures, the boundaries between separate traditions begin to blur. Was the story of the garden an original revelation, or was it a refined reinterpretation of a much older, more widespread cultural memory? By placing Adapa beside Adam, we are forced to confront the possibility the tragedy of Adapa hinges on a single devastating deception. Standing before the throne of the sky god Anu, Adapa was offered the bread and water of eternal life. It was the ultimate prize, the end of the long struggle against the decay of the flesh. But he had been warned by his patron, Enki, that this food was actually the bread and water of death. He refused the gift. He turned away from immortality, believing he was choosing survival, only to realize too late that he had been manipulated by the very gods he served. The door to eternal life slammed shut, leaving him to wither in the slow, relentless grip of time. This is the echo that resonates through the halls of history. Just as Adam was cast out of the garden for a single act of disobedience, Adapa was denied his divinity through a cruel, calculated trick. The parallels are not merely coincidental. They point to a deep-seated anxiety about our own fleeting existence. We see in both figures a reflection of the human condition, the desire to transcend our limits, the vulnerability to forces beyond our control, and the bitter realization that we were meant for something more. If we strip away the layers of myth and look at the core of the creation account, a far more clinical possibility emerges. What if the story of dust and breath is a primitive way of describing a precise, deliberate act of biological engineering? We must consider the genetic intervention theory, a perspective that views Adam not as a spontaneous creation, but as a calculated upgrade. Imagine a world already scarred by a global cataclysm, a landscape where the previous inhabitants had been wiped away. In this desolate aftermath, the narrative suggests a new lineage was introduced, a group specifically designed to survive and steward a broken planet. This was not a miracle of clay, but a feat of design. The term "formed from the dust" might be a veiled reference to the raw, foundational materials of life. The implications are radical. It suggests that the garden was not a playground, but a controlled environment, a laboratory for a new type of existence. We are no longer looking at a simple story of obedience and fall, but at the potential remnants of a sophisticated, ancient technology that fundamentally altered the course of our species. If Adam was truly a survivor of a previous fallen world, then the garden was not a beginning, but a lifeboat. Consider the state of the earth before his arrival, a landscape defined by the echoes of a cataclysmic collapse. The survivors of that earlier epoch were gone, leaving behind only the ruins of a civilization that had reached too far. Adam was not the first of his kind, but the last of a lineage specifically re-engineered to endure the harsh post-disaster reality. This was a biological reboot, a calculated attempt to preserve the spark of intelligence in a world that had already seen its own end. The genetic modifications were not for vanity, but for survival, a heightened resilience, an accelerated capacity to learn, and an instinct to steward the broken remnants of the planet. We are forced to confront a jarring possibility. Our very existence is the result of a desperate, high-stakes intervention. We are the descendants of a prototype, a lineage designed to rise from the ashes of a predecessor that failed. If Adam was a calculated design, then who held the pen? The theory of ancient intervention forces us to look upward, beyond the clouds, to entities whose reach span the stars. We must consider that the architects of our Genesis were not ethereal spirits, but advanced, physical beings, who treated the Earth as a vast, planetary laboratory. This perspective transforms the garden from a sacred sanctuary into a controlled containment zone. The sons of God mentioned in ancient records were not merely mythological figures. They were the technicians, the overseers, and the engineers of our biological reality. They did not just watch the experiment, they directed it, monitoring the progress of their creation with cold, clinical precision. This realization is jarring. It suggests that our capacity for reason, our physical form, and even our drive to survive were not natural evolutions, but programmed parameters. We are the result of a deliberate, long-term study. A species engineered to fulfill a specific role in a grander, extraterrestrial agenda. The garden was the first phase of this trial. Are we merely the subjects of an ongoing experiment, still unfolding under the watchful eyes of those who initiated our existence? The silence of the heavens is the distance of a scientist. If the experiment was cold, the Gnostic truth is colder. Ancient texts like the Pistis Sophia suggest that Adam was never meant to be a creature of earth. He was a being of pure, luminous spirit, a fragment of the divine light that existed long before the first Adam was forged. His descent into this world was not an act of creation, but a violent capture. The Archons, those lesser, ignorant cosmic forces, saw the radiance of the first man and feared its power. To contain it, they fashioned a prison. They wove a tunic of skin, a heavy, suffocating shell of matter, and forced the spirit of Adam into this physical cage. This was not a birth. It was an abduction. Every heartbeat, every breath, and every physical limitation we experience is a bar in that cell. The Archons did not build us to thrive. They built us to dim the light, to entangle the divine within the mundane, and to keep the spirit tethered to a realm of decay. We are not merely biological machines or laboratory subjects. We are prisoners of a cosmic deception, our true essence muffled by the density of flesh. The world we perceive is not a paradise, but a veil drawn over our eyes to keep us from remembering the light we once were. We are living in a manufactured shadow. The descent was not a graceful transition. It was a violent fragmentation of the infinite. Imagine a being of pure, expansive light, capable of spanning the distance between stars, suddenly compressed into a single point of matter. This was the fate of the primordial man. The transition from the divine realm to the physical plane required a total stripping away of essence. Every layer of light was peeled back, replaced by the heavy, unyielding density of bone, blood, and muscle. The Archons did not merely build a cage. They forced the spirit to become the cage itself. As the descent deepened, the memory of the infinite began to fracture. The vast, cosmic awareness that once defined the first man was narrowed down to the limited sensory input of a physical body. Sight became restricted to the visible spectrum. Hearing became bound by the vibration of air. The ability to touch the fabric of creation was replaced by the clumsy interaction with solid objects. The weight of this existence is not just physical. It is the constant, crushing pressure of a spirit trying to expand within a vessel that was never meant to hold it. The narrative of our origin is not a continuous line. It is a broken record. Look at the opening of the ancient scrolls. Genesis 1, verse 1. The heavens and the earth are forged in a single, definitive act. Then, verse 2 arrives, and the entire structure vanishes. The earth is no longer a garden. It is a wasteland. It is formless. It is void. Darkness swallows the deep. This is not a description of the beginning. It is a description of an aftermath. Between these two verses lies a silence that spans eons. Proponents of the gap theory argue that this is the smoking gun of a forgotten history. Before Adam ever drew breath, an entire world existed here. It rose, it built, and it fell. God did not create the world from a blank slate. He refashioned it from the wreckage of a previous, failed experiment. The void was not an absence of creation. It was the graveyard of a world that came before. It illuminated the debris of a civilization that had already been erased. The reconstruction of the world did not result in a single, unified lineage. As the dust of the previous collapse settled, the earth became a stage for multiple, distinct populations. Genesis speaks of the sons of God descending to intermingle with the daughters of men. This was not a metaphorical union. It was a physical, genetic convergence that fundamentally altered the trajectory of human development. From these unions rose the Nephilim. They were not merely tall, they were giants in the earth, a physical anomaly that defied the standard biological limits of the time. Their presence proves that the world was already occupied by diverse groups before the Adamic line took root. Adam was a specialized creation, a carefully engineered lineage intended to remain distinct, yet he existed in a landscape already populated by these pre-Adamic remnants and their hybrid descendants. This creates a fractured history. We are not looking at a single, clean descent from one couple, but a complex, overlapping map of different human types. The giants walked the same ground as the early humans, their presence a constant, looming reminder that the story of humanity is far more crowded and chaotic. Beyond the hybrid bloodlines and the giants, ancient texts hold a memory of a different Adam. Jewish Midrash preserves a tradition that defies our modern understanding of scale. It describes a being whose presence was not confined to the surface of the earth. In this original state, Adam was colossal, his form stretching from the soil beneath his feet to the very reaches of the heavens. He was not a man of flesh and bone as we define them, but a vessel of immense, non-physical power. He was a bridge between the divine and the material, a titan of spiritual stature that commanded the fabric of reality itself. Then came the shift. The texts speak of a sudden, drastic reduction, a divine act that collapsed this vast entity into the limited physical frame we recognize today. This was not merely a change in size. It was a fundamental loss of essence. The colossal Adam was a being of pure connection, a reflection of the infinite. The Adam that remained was a shadow, a diminished mirror of that original, towering potential. We are left with the remnants of this story, a glimpse into a time when the first man was not a creature of the earth, but an entity that spanned the cosmos. The physical world we inhabit is the result of that contraction. The loss of stature was only the beginning of the decline. With the contraction of form came the silencing of the first tongue. Tradition speaks of an Adamic language, a universal code that existed before the fragmentation of human speech. This was not a system of labels or descriptions. It was a divine frequency, a set of sounds that resonated with the very essence of the things they named. When the first man spoke, he did not merely communicate, he commanded. To name a creature was to define its nature, to bind its purpose, and to exert direct influence over its physical existence. This was a language of creation, a tool that allowed the speaker to manipulate the fabric of the world with a single word. It was a mastery of reality that we have since forgotten. Today, we use language to describe the world from a distance, to analyze and categorize what we cannot control. But the Adamic tongue was an instrument of participation, a bridge between the mind and the material. When that language faded, the connection was severed. We were left with words that described the surface, while the power to shape the core vanished into the silence of history. The world became an object to be observed rather than a creation to be spoken into existence. We are left with a mosaic of fragments that refuse to align into a single, simple origin. The Gnostic vision of a spiritual being trapped in a tunic of skin, the Sumerian tragedy of Adapa, and the theological silence of the gap theory all point toward the same unsettling conclusion. Adam was not the beginning. He was a pivot point. When we strip away the layers of interpretation, we find a recurring pattern of restart, intervention, and contraction. The traditions of the East and the West, the mystical and the historical, all converge on a singular, haunting realization. The story we have been told is merely one chapter in a much older, more complex saga. We are looking at a history that predates our records, a timeline where humanity has risen and fallen long before the garden gates were ever closed. Every theory, from the engineered biological upgrade to the cosmic entity of light, suggests that our current existence is a reboot of a previous, more profound reality. The evidence is not in the consistency of the tales, but in their shared obsession with what came before. Adam is not the source. He is the survivor of a forgotten epoch, a figure standing at the threshold of a past that remains just out of reach. If Adam was a pivot, what stood before him? If the language of creation was once ours, why does the world now remain silent to our commands? We are left standing at the edge of a vast, unrecorded epoch, staring into a past that refuses to be fully known. Every myth, every fragment of ancient text, acts as a mirror reflecting a version of humanity that has been systematically erased. We are not the first to walk this earth, nor are we the first to wonder why we are here. The story of our genesis is not a closed book. It is a recurring cycle, a series of echoes from a time when the boundaries between the divine and the physical were thin. We are the inheritors of a forgotten legacy, living in the shadow of a much older, more complex truth. We are still here, we are still asking, and the past is still watching.